Hey y'all, I hope you're having a good day. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about some things that I wanted to make sure eventually get on the page. And I think it's important to start talking about definitions, having a vocabulary, having language for some of the things that we're working through. So I wanted to make sure that we have language about abuse and neglect, what those things are, what the definitions of those things are, what they can look like, etc. Obviously, it's a pretty heavy message today, so if it's not for you right now, that's okay. Just hop on over and maybe come back later. With that being said, today there's a couple disclaimers that I have before we get started. First off, this might be a long video. Abuse is not something that is easily talked about, and it's not something that's easily described. Secondly, trigger warning. Obviously, we're going to be talking about all the base kinds of abuse and neglect, and that can be very sensitive and very triggering for some people, and it can bring up memories that have been either processed or unprocessed, and it's just a lot. So again, if you're not in the right headspace, please just come on back later. The last one that I want to talk about is that all of these definitions, as we go through them, are not subjective to one particular age or dynamic in a relationship. It is not subjective to just a parent and a child dynamic. It is not subjective to under the age of 18. It is not subjective to any kind of distinct identity factors. Unfortunately, abuse and neglect transcend all types of identity, all types of barriers, all types of upbringing. It doesn't matter if you were very wealthy. It doesn't matter if you were in a small town community feel. It doesn't matter if you were white or black or Asian. It doesn't matter. Yeah, so I just want that to be known before we get started. And then the very, very, very last thing I guess that I should tack on to the end is that if you are not feeling that you are being taken care of properly, if you are worried that you have experienced abuse and neglect or are currently experiencing abuse and neglect, please find someone to talk to. Please find a way to make yourself just a tad bit more safe. Please try to ensure that you are utilizing the resources that you have that are available to you. And if you don't know where to start, the perfect first way to start is 741-741. Text that number and it will walk you through any crisis, anything that you deem a crisis, and they will connect you with the resources that they know how to. With that all being said and put into wraps, why don't we go ahead and get started. So when I think about abuse and neglect, I kind of categorize them into different capacities. One is abuse, one is neglect. Of course, it doesn't matter how you decide to, but I just think that there's a little bit of like some similarities in some of those themes. So when we talk about abuse, the first one that I think about is physical abuse. This is, utilizing physical force and trying to deliberately harm someone with that. A lot of times this looks like slapping, hitting, punching. Sometimes this looks like beating someone with an object. This can also look like forcing a person to withdraw into a physical environment that was not consensual. So locking them in a closet, locking them in a cage, locking them in the basement, like those are all physical confinements, so that is also categorized as physical abuse. Something that I have recently learned is that physical abuse can also look like parameters around physicality in your body. So not allowing someone to sleep, consistently waking them up so that they're not able to get that sleep and rest that their body needs to be able to function, that is also physical abuse. So there's a lot of things that go into this, obviously, but those are some good examples. And again, want to remind you that this doesn't have to be between a parent and a child. It can be between anybody. And lastly, that there's some interesting differences in the law regarding different types of abuse and what constitutes. And physical abuse is specifically one of those because several states have determined that any kind of disciplining with an object is an abuse factor. So for instance, Illinois, I'm pretty sure, is one of those states. So a lot of people will state that they grew up getting beat with a belt, right? Or beat with a spatula, whatever it is. And many states are now saying that any kind of object that you are utilizing to enforce discipline is abuse. So that's just something to look into and be aware of what constitutes as abuse in your state, specifically around that physicality section. The next one that I wanted to go over is sexual abuse. This one is any kind of behavior that is elicited or conducted to another individual that's sexual in nature and not consensual to that individual. What's interesting about sexual abuse is that there is obviously a pretty enforceable scale that we have accustomed ourselves to on that low end of sexual harassment, where nothing is physically done, right? But we are still hearing things, innuendos, catcalling, etc., all the way into sexual contact, whether that is reciprocal or not, and then eventually into like those further dynamics. Something that I want to hit hard on in this section is that a lot of times survivors that I have spoken with have believed that they did not experience sexual abuse because they were not the receiver of it. They were not like a person was not victimizing them into that situation, but instead they were victimized to be the person to elicit that act. So specifically, like as children, we'll see grooming, or we'll have potentially a victim who is coerced into doing the sexual act themselves on another person. That is still sexual abuse. Again, if it is not a consensual sexual behavior, then it is abuse. And lastly, what's really important in that section is that if you are under the age of 18, if you are a minor, in the eyes of the law, you are not able to give consent. There are laws against that, and a great example of that would be like in a residential home or a detention center. There are laws that enforce the workers to make sure that no sexual conduct is happening, because it is considered essentially rape on each other. So it is considered kiddos reenacting trauma, sexual trauma, and victimizing each other in that way. So if you are not over the age of 18, you cannot consent. So keep that in mind as you go on about your business. The next one is emotional abuse. This one sometimes can also be called psychological abuse, and there's a little bit of like some intersections. All of these obviously can have intersections together, but emotional abuse is essentially anything that is done to you emotionally to cause you harm, fear, control, and is used to victimize you in that way. A lot of times we see tactics like gaslighting or emotional manipulation or like thought leading, some of these things that try to elicit a certain emotional response. And that is a great example of what emotional abuse can be. I also think it's important to look at emotional abuse on a different format, and that other format would be not allowing a person to have their own emotional response. That is also just as abusive. So trying to enforce a certain narrative and not allowing a person to have like a true, genuine response. Verbal abuse can kind of be thrown in there. That's the next one that I want to hit on, and that one is essentially utilizing words to cause distress or psychological harm. These things I like to describe it as like utilizing words as weapons. I think a lot of us know what that looks like. It wraps into bullying, it wraps into maybe like childhood parenting. It can go into a lot of different factors. And then the last one that I want to talk about in terms of kind of our base abuses would be psychological abuses, which I hit on a little bit prior. This one, a lot of times, is considered mental abuse. Sometimes it is considered mental emotional abuse, and so they kind of wrap that emotional section in there. It really just depends on who you're talking to and what website you're looking at. But ultimately, psychological abuse is any kind of abuse that has a mental and emotional impact that is utilized to cause consistent and severe mental and emotional harm. Psychological abuse is really interesting and damaging, I guess, is really the best way for me to describe it, because it has such a profound impact on how your brain is able to function, how you're able to show up, and how you're able to grow and heal. Psychological abuse often manipulates and rewires the way that your brain understands, perceives the context of what things are happening. What's important about this one specifically in regards to all of the actual damaging impacts that it can have is that a lot of times psychological abuse is something that is done and or intended because further abuse can happen if there is some kind of an abuse or a damaging impact on the mental state. So if I am not aware or I am led to believe that what is currently happening in my environment is not abusive, so if you are stating things verbally to me that make me incredibly distressed and worried for my safety, if you consistently make sure that my environment does not feel emotionally safe, but I am led to believe in a mental format that those things are not actually happening. It's just my response because of something else, right? Because of my own trauma, because I'm just not understanding what you're trying to do. Like, that was not your intentions, and I know that now, right? Those kinds of things, if I am misled to believe something else, then the abuse can still happen. So psychological abuse is really the first way for manipulators, for toxic people, for abusers to further commit to the engagement of mistreatment for you. And then the other thing that I want to note about it is that psychological abuse and really any form of abuse, a lot of times they have intersections. So if you've experienced sexual abuse, you've also likely experienced emotional and mental abuse. If you've experienced physical abuse, likely you've experienced some of the other abuses as well. A lot of times those things are intersected and interwebbed because we are holistic beings. One action or experience does not just impact one part of us, it impacts our whole being, right? And so if I've now been engaged in a violent act or an abusive act and also wasn't allowed to express my true response to it, and I also wasn't able to validate that it was an abusive act, it was something that was against my will, that wasn't good for me, that wasn't protective of me, etc., then I am going to have trauma in that other section as well. Yeah, I think that's kind of it for that little section. There is a few like little key asterisks that I have as well. There are other ways that abuse can happen, and so these ones are abuses that can happen in formats that are slightly different, but still definitely important. So the next one would be financial abuse. So someone being controlling of your financial means, how you're using your money, how you're using your assets, and how much access you have to those things. That is financial abuse. That can be super damaging to you and your health as well. And then lastly, there's one that we would consider like cultural or identity abuse. And this kind of abuse is essentially not allowing a person to be who they are. So specifically, that's a great example in my brain is like LGBTQ, or potentially even I suppose like I'm thinking about like really limiting beliefs or like really limiting ideas about what a person should be or a thing should be. So a woman should be this and you don't identify as those things. Or a man should be this and you also identify as queer, right? And consistently hearing remarks or negativity or false narratives or essentially opposing nature of what that identity is, that can be abusive to you as a person. You are now not accepting and feeling comfortable in the things that potentially you have found identity in, as well as being essentially victimized for having those characteristics. So those are ones that are definitely less talked about, but just as impactful. They are ones that, again, I think have like a lot of little intersections, that we see those things happening a lot in regards to other things, but we don't always necessarily hear them. The next little section that I have for you is the neglect section. And the neglect is much shorter, so bear with me. The first one is physical neglect. This one is something that, again, we don't talk about a whole lot, but it is something that I've heard more of in the last couple of years. This is essentially not taking care of a physical need that has been presented. What I will say about some of these neglect characteristics is that it is dependent on an individual not being able to have the capacity to care for themselves in this way. That doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be a child. It can be an elder. It can be a person who has a disablement. It can be a person who has limited cognitive abilities. It could be something in that kind of a nature. But regardless, it is this idea that you have a physical need and that need is not being met. Instead, it's not being acknowledged and it just isn't being taken care of at all. So a great example of this would be babies not changing diapers, not brushing teeth consistently, not packing like a communication device that somebody needs in order to communicate, otherwise they don't have any opportunity to communicate needs. It could be not taking them to physical appointments like health appointments, which I would consider that a little subcategory of medical neglect, not enforcing healthcare, those kinds of things. But that is that physicality version of that. There is also a sister, and that sister would be emotional neglect. And emotional neglect is essentially the same thing, but it is with emotional needs. So not providing an adequate, appropriate sense of emotional need for an individual that presents. This one, again, can have some of those barriers in terms of like someone who is not able to fulfill their own emotional needs, but it also really does have the same kind of factors as some of these other abuses, because you can also be completely able-bodied, able-minded, able everything, and still experience emotional neglect in a relationship with your partner. But what I specifically like to talk about when we talk about emotional neglect is child-parent relationships, because we do know at this point in the game that attachment is huge for kiddos. That really from 0, from birth to 5, that's where like the primary attachment happens. And that primary attachment sets up a kiddo for the rest of their life. It helps them determine what love is. It helps them determine what esteem is. It helps them determine how to treat themselves and other people. It really is a base model, a role model for how to engage in all relationships and how to meet self and others' needs appropriately, not in a maladaptive way, not in a survival brain method. And so when a kiddo is not given the emotional needs that they have as a child, rather they don't have any kind of emotional response from a parent. They never see pride from a parent. They never see compassion from a parent. They never see humanity from a parent in terms of it's okay to just be a human, to have human moments, to feel distress, to have feelings. Then that kiddo learns that those things aren't okay. And then they suddenly are in a space where they are having a human experience and being showed around them that human experience is not normal. It is normal, right? We know that that's absolutely normal to have feelings and to have reactions about the life that we're experiencing. But if around them they're constantly told, you're being dramatic, you're being too much, you're too sensitive, shut up and go outside, life is too hard, like you're gonna have to work for things, and that's kind of a base level of that. But if they're consistently engulfed in that kind of a narrative and not met with an emotional need or an emotional importance, then they genuinely are taught that their self-esteem and their emotional attachment to self and to others is not important. So that one is a huge, huge, huge one. I think that's one that I like to focus on a lot because I don't ever hear anybody talking about that. And that one specifically is what led me to drive this page. Emotional neglect is really difficult to deal with and to grow up with, and then to learn that's what this is. There isn't a lot of labels, there isn't a lot of anything with it. And then lastly, I guess I just wanted to note that okay, 2 things. So sorry. With that emotional neglect, another version of that we often hear, it's not talked about in the format of emotional neglect, but it's talked about in the form of that child-parent dynamic. And so that child-parent dynamic, and the phrase that you may have heard, is emotionally immature parents, EI parents. There's a great book too, actually, that have come out recently, in the last decade or so, that talk about recovering from emotionally immature parents, and discovering what emotionally immature parents are. And there's lots of really great narratives about what that looks like, and how essentially it's a lot of growing up with consistent dismissive and avoidant parents. And so just never really getting needs met because they're never active. Those parents aren't active in the way that they need to be. So with that being said, the very last thing that I want to cue in on is something called an ACEs score. This is 100% me pulling from social work, and from the mental health profession. But if you have time, if you're interested, It's a really great tool, and it's really interesting. It's really eye-opening. ACEs is a survey that many practitioners will give to clients and or will do as an assessment when they start to provide services. And this survey essentially scores for childhood traumas, specifically childhood traumas. It asks a series of questions. Sometimes the questions are 10 or so, sometimes it's more like 20. But regardless, it is a series of questions that will say, did you experience this happening in your childhood? And they're pretty specific. It's not going to say, did you experience physical abuse? It's going to say, did you ever experience a parent or caregiver physically hitting you? Did you ever witness a parent hit you or hit one of your siblings? Did you ever witness your parents engaging in that kind of behavior together? What's interesting is they also score for emotional abuse and emotional neglect. So they'll also ask things like, did you often feel dismissed by an emotional standard? Did you feel that you had a safe parent that you could go to when you had an emotional need? So it's a really, really interesting score. Anything, essentially, like every score that you have, that's a number. Okay. And obviously it's a number, but it's a score. So it's a point. You have 3 that you said yes to. You've experienced at least 3 childhood traumas. The higher the ACE score, the higher the trauma. And I think that's important to note too, that every time you've experienced one trauma, like I've mentioned, obviously there's intersections. We are holistic beings. And so you're going to experience some level of some of the other traumas as well. But if you've experienced several traumas stacked on top of each other, we call that complex trauma. And context matters, consistency matters, like duration matters, and that's a whole different video, which we will do at another date. But regardless, it's important to note that the more trauma that you have endured, the more difficult it is to go through a healing process, because there's more intersections and more crossroads and more feelings, more impacts, and more layers. And trauma is layers, like an onion. So that's the video for today. If you have any questions or you have any comments or you want to share a story, I'm here for it. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and hopefully you have a reason to smile.